So good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim O'Shea, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University, and it's a great pleasure to welcome such a distinguished audience to this panel event on such an important and topical subject. The subject being the relationship between the world of Islam and the West. And the event this evening has been arranged by the Alwaleed Centre for the Study of Islam in the Contemporary World. The network of Alwaleed centres around the world is a unique one, linking as it does centres in the West, in the United States and the United Kingdom, which are primarily devoted to the study of Islam, with centres in the Middle East, in Lebanon and Egypt, which are primarily devoted to the study of the West and of the United States in particular. May I pay tribute to the vision of His Royal Highness Prince Alwaleed bin Talal as he seeks to improve mutual understanding between the world of Islam and the West through establishing this network. And I'd like to express our thanks both to him personally and to Ms. Muna Abu Suleiman. It's very good to see you here again, who is the director of the Alwaleed bin Talal Foundation, and their endowment and their support of the Edinburgh Alwaleed Centre is very, very important. As well as welcoming the staff and administrators of all 6 Alwaleed centres who are currently holding their annual meeting here in Edinburgh, it's a particular pleasure to welcome a number of distinguished guests this evening, including the US Consul, Dana Lynette, the head of the European Commission in Scotland, Neil Mitchison, the Pakistani Consul, Mr. Shirer Akbar Khan, and the Consuls of Austria, Jordan and Spain. It is also a great pleasure to welcome a number of journalists from the Press Association, the BBC, local Scottish newspapers, and senior colleagues from the Army and the police locally, and colleagues from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Global Islam Programme, and also from the government in Scotland. It's very good to see you all here and to see you in the university's most important and distinguished venue. I'm now going to ask Ms. Muna Abu Suleiman, the director of the Alwaleed Foundation, to say a few words, and then I will hand over to my colleagues, the directors of the 6 Alwaleed centres. They are, in the order in which they're going to speak, Professor Hugh Goddard, director of the Alwaleed Centre for the Study of Islam in the Contemporary World here in Edinburgh. And you can indicate, pretend you're a panel show, so the audience will know who you are. Dr. Robert Myers, director of the Alwaleed Centre for American Studies and Research in the American University of Beirut. Professor Roy Mottahedeh, director of the Prince Alwaleed Islamic Centers Program at Harvard. Dr. Jerry Leach, director of the Alwaleed Center for American Studies and Research at the American University in Cairo. Professor Yasir Suleiman, director of the Prince Alwaleed Center for Islamic Studies in Cambridge. And Professor John Esposito, director of the Prince Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. The full title for the panel this evening is The World of Islam and the West, The View from Beirut, Boston, Cairo, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and Washington, D.C. And I'm very much looking forward to gaining a truly global vision of the relationship between the world of Islam and the West from the presentations and from the question and answer. But before we do that, I'm asking the director of the Alwaleed Foundation to say a few words, please.
On behalf of the Foundation and Prince Alwaleed, I wanted to welcome you all to this timely and exciting event. My thanks also go to Professor Timothy O'Shea and Professor Hugh for hosting us, and especially to the University of Edinburgh for hosting the center itself. I do hope this event will be enlightening, informative discussion on the nature of the relationship between Islam and the West, especially that it's a very timely subject. I remember when I came here in 2006, when Edinburgh had just given the presentation for the center. It was a great presentation, but we had seen it in soft copy. We did not actually come to the university until afterwards. And the team that was here was so enthusiastic, was so excited to actually work with us to create something that would be of help to the university, but also to Edinburgh itself, to the community, and to the UK. And we can see now, in the past 5 years, how much work has been done, and we're very delighted with the leadership that Dr. Hugh is presenting. Right now, in the Middle East, there's a lot of changes. Alwaleed had written an op-ed in the New York Times discussing the reforms and changes that are needed for the Middle East to actually join the 21st century. But in order for reform and change to be effective, it must be the result of meaningful interaction and dialogue, not enforced, not imposed by anyone. We're fortunate this evening to have gathered some of the world's most leading experts and scholars on the subject between the Arab world and the West. And I believe it's their dedication to maintaining a dialogue and a real conversation between the two worlds that will make all the difference in how the future for all of us unfolds. I do hope that during the conversations that occur, the type of questions that will come out will be about how central can Edinburgh and Scotland and the UK be for solving some of the most pressing issues in our time, especially for security, and that through engaging with the audience, we can come up with a few solutions. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Well, may I add my own welcome to you all as Director of the Edinburgh Alwaleed Centre. It's very nice to see you all. Special welcome to colleagues. It's very nice to do an event together of this kind. And I'm very pleased that on this International Women's Day, we have been able to have at least one woman contributor to the procedures. Now, as Muna has said, the topic for this panel event, the world of Islam and the West, was originally selected partly because 2011 is the 10th anniversary of the events of the 11th of September 2001, the events which had a huge impact on the relationship between the world of Islam and the West. Now, since the topic was selected a few months ago, there has been a far greater focus in the media and elsewhere on internal events within both the Arab world and Pakistan, the former of which in the Arab world, according to media reports last weekend, have even had an impact in China, where the government has been taking a number of measures to try and preempt popular discontent. These internal events within the world of Islam, however, do also have an impact on the relationship between the world of Islam and the West. The topic remains highly pertinent, and we're going to start with our local Scottish context. How does the world of Islam and the West relationship look from here? Now, in the local situation, there have, I'm going to suggest, over the course of the past 25 years, been two incidents in which Scotland appears as, in some sense, a victim of some of the problems in the relationship between the world of Islam and the West. The first I refer to is the Lockerbie bombing on the 21st of December 1988, when, as a result of a mid-air explosion, Pan Am Flight 103 fell on the town of Lockerbie, leading to the death of 270 people. 2 Libyan agents were put on trial at a Scottish court in the Netherlands. One was found innocent. The other, Abdul Basit al-Megrahi, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment on the 31st of January 2001. On the 20th of August 2009, however, he was released on compassionate grounds, and this decision led to vigorous debate within Scotland, within the wider UK, and internationally. And the Minister for Justice, who was responsible for that decision, did receive wide support for his decision from different members of the religious communities here in Scotland, including the Church of Scotland, Roman Catholic, and other religious leaders. Precise responsibility remains still slightly opaque, but the more recent statement from Mustafa Abdul Jalil in Libya indicating that Libya was responsible remains uncorroborated. The whole situation, therefore, remains extremely complicated. But it's worth noting in the context of our discussion that since 1969, despite the rhetorical use of Islam as a slogan, Libya and its leader have not, in any meaningful sense, been applying the principles of Islam, because secular Arab nationalism has in practice been a far more influential factor in the formulation of state policy. The Lockerbie bombing is the first example of Scotland as, in some sense, a victim of some of these problems. The Glasgow airport bombings of the 30th of June 2007, when Bilal Abdullah, an English-born medical doctor of Iraqi descent, and Kafil Ahmed, a mechanical engineer born in Bangalore in India, attempted to set off a car explosion in Glasgow airport. An event which was significantly different from the London bombings of 2 years earlier, in that no one apart from the perpetrators died, and the fact that the perpetrators were not British-born Muslims of South Asian origin. But the incident caused considerable anguish among Scottish Muslims, as reflected in the meditation of Naeem Raza on the BBC website. Two examples then of Scotland as, in some sense, a victim of problems in the relationship between the world of Islam and the West within the past 25 or so years. If we now look on a slightly longer scale, stretching things out to perhaps 125 years, two examples of where Scotland appears as, in some sense, a contributor to some of the problems in the relationship between the world of Islam and the West, through two individuals, each of whom, interestingly, have a close connection with the University of Edinburgh. First of our two figures, Sir William Muir, was principal of the University of Edinburgh from 1885 to 1903, and you will have passed his portrait as you came up the stairs on your right, on the left as you go down. And it was during his time that the dome of Old College, under which we've all passed one of the great Edinburgh landmarks, was completed. Now, Muir was born in 1819 in Glasgow, worked in India as a civil servant in the Indian Imperial Administration, and in 1868 became the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Provinces, what would today be called the Punjab. And as a pious evangelical Christian, as well as an imperial administrator, and then an academic, principal of this university, one of his other achievements was the writing of a critical study of the life of Muhammad. Though the word critical is one of those words which it is, of course, extremely important to define carefully. Critical can mean analytical, in the sense in which all arts and social science academics attempt to encourage critical thinking, can also, of course, be critical in the sense of negative. And Muir's biography, I think it's fair to say, was probably critical in both senses. Nevertheless, he was, in the context of his own time, attempting to use the historical critical method in order to investigate the background to and origins of the Muslim community. And he was very different from some more contemporary evangelical Christians, very different kind of figure from someone like Pastor Terry Jones, for example, as seen in the fact that during his time as principal, one of the most effective critics of his work, Syed Ahmed Khan, was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Edinburgh in absentia. So for all the controversy, for all the resentment, there was also a relationship of respect and discussion. Second contributor in the Scottish context to some of the problems in the relationship between the world of Islam was Arthur James Balfour, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1902 to 1905, Foreign Secretary from 1916 to 1919, and Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh from 1891 to 1930. So you will have passed his portrait on your left as you came up the stairs, and you can see it on your right as you leave. In our context, of course, Balfour is significant because of his declaration of the 2nd of November 1917, in which he stated that His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, subject to the preservation of the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. Declaration which proved such a significant point in the process which led to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Problem is that Mr. Balfour, in his declaration, was not trying to create a problem in the relationship between the world of Islam and the West, but the reality is that clearly it did. He probably thought of himself as contributing to the resolution of another problem, the problem of anti-Semitism in the West. But like many well-intentioned pronouncements, the consequences were not necessarily foreseen. And one thing we can say with complete certainty with respect to the relationship between the world of Islam and the West today is that it would be very different, considerably better, if Mr. Balfour had not issued his 1917 declaration. How the centenary of that declaration in 6 years' time is marked is going to be an extremely difficult challenge, therefore. So these two incidents from the past 25 years illustrate, as I've said, the situation, perhaps, of Scotland as victim in the relationship between the world of Islam and the West. The legacy of Muir and Balfour is perhaps an indication of ways in which Scotland has contributed to some of the problems, and illustrate between them, I hope, the complexity of the relationship. I hand over now to Dr. Myers from Beirut.
Thank you, Hugh. I'd like to begin by thanking the University of Edinburgh, thanking the Kingdom Foundation, Muna Abu Suleiman and Noor al-Dabaha, and everyone from the Kingdom Foundation, and Hugh and his staff. They've been extraordinarily gracious to us all, and I know how difficult it is because I welcomed you in Beirut last year. I'd like to begin with two ideas that come from Freud's essay, Civilization and Its Discontents. Freud posits that two of the most pleasurable activities are scientific experimentation and artistic creation. It's rather odd coming from Freud, but I'm a playwright and I can attest that, at least in my experience, it's true. In this same essay, he coins a phrase called the narcissism of small differences, and he gives the example of Spain and Portugal. Well, my degree is in Spanish and Portuguese, and I can attest that if you go to Spain and the weathercaster shows the weather, there's no weather in Portugal, and vice versa. So, however, for those of you who know a bit about Spanish medieval history, the period when the Iberian Peninsula was called Al-Andalus, you know that the mutual distaste was not always the case. In fact, a number of modern medieval scholars have celebrated the so-called convivencia, the moment of productive coexistence between Muslims, Jews, and Christians in medieval Iberia before there even were Spanish and Portuguese. And they've celebrated it as a paradigm of cross-cultural and cross-religious creativity. Well, what does all this have to do with the current view from Beirut, which is on the other side of the Mediterranean? Almost from the moment I arrived in Beirut in 2004, Lebanon has been racked by civil and military strife, and most of it is based ostensibly on religious sectarianism. The Prince Alwaleed Center for American Studies was also founded in 2004 with a mission to increase understanding between East and West. In 2005, as many of you must know, Rafiq Hariri, who was the prime minister, was assassinated, and that set off a whole series of events in Lebanon, a demonstration on March 8th by the supporters of Hezbollah, March 14th, the supporters of Hariri. A number of anti-Syrian figures were assassinated. Eventually, Syria withdrew. There was a war in 2006 when Israel was provoked by Hezbollah, which grabbed 2 Israeli soldiers at the border. The war lasted for 40 days. There was a protracted stalemate from 2007 to 2009. Eventually, Saad Hariri, the son of Rafiq Hariri, formed a government. Well, very recently, the government of Saad Hariri fell. And it did, in large measure, because of a UN tribunal, which was formed to investigate the assassination of his father and all of these other figures. So as this litany of events makes clear, Beirut has been in the limelight for a number of years in the Middle East. Nonetheless, all of a sudden, with calls for reform in the Arab world, it finds that it's not in the limelight again. Oddly, Lebanon is a democracy of sorts, like Turkey. One could even say somewhat like Gaza, which held elections. In the United States, for example, Israel is touted as the only democracy in the Middle East, although it's clearly a very imperfect one. As I said, Lebanon is also an imperfect democracy. Probably the best example of that is its confessional system, which is one of the most paradoxical, it results from one of the most paradoxical peace treaties in human history, in which the causes for the war, i.e. the confessional system, are enshrined in the peace treaty, which is to say that the parliamentary system is apportioned by sect, and major figures such as prime minister, president, speaker are reserved for certain sects. Well, certainly this is the legacy of neocolonialism, and meddling is a central aspect of the Lebanese political system. This we see most clearly in the fall of Saad Hariri's government, when there were claims that the UN tribunal was, in fact, meddling, taking sides, and was not engaged in a fair system of investigation. However, as I said, the uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and now Libya have diverted attention from Lebanon, and there's nothing worse for a narcissist than to be ignored. And suddenly Lebanon's internal religious squabbling looks pettier than ever. But unlike so many other Arab countries, there's not one autocrat against whom people can direct their anger. There are many ancient political players. Most of them have been around since before the Civil War. In 2008, in fact, there was a joke in 2008 when Hezbollah rose up on the streets to show their military muscle, and eventually all of the major players went to Qatar to try to resolve the problem. The solution that the Lebanese offered at that point with all of their leaders in Qatar was to close the airport. So who or what do you protest against when the corruption is so widely dispersed? And the answer, interestingly, was provided by young people the day that I left, Sunday. What you protest against is the confessional system. There was a large protest by several thousand in Beirut on Sunday, and I would say this is another hopeful sign in the Arab world. The Lebanese protesters, mostly young people, are what we might call the new nationalists. And nationalism, I would argue, like narcissism, is actually a very good thing up to a point. And I would point, for example, to Turkey, to Brazil, to Korea, though, of course, we know nationalism is a bad thing, like narcissism, beyond that point. Germany in the 30s and Italy, Japan, etc. T.E. Lawrence famously said that Arab nationalism is nothing more than occasional alliance against a foreign invader. Well, let's hope that these young Lebanese, like their counterparts in Egypt, Tunisia, at Libya, and elsewhere in the Arab world, are in the process of proving Lawrence and the other colonialists wrong. And finally, there is, I would argue, no greater pleasure than creating your own democratic country. Like almost all Beirutis, I salute those throughout the Arab world who are fighting for their freedom. Thank you. Roy Mottahedeh from Harvard.
First, I should reveal to you, is this clear? Oh, yes. First, I should reveal to you that while this is called The View from Boston, I'm not a proper Bostonian. I'm not, sadly, even an improper Bostonian. Harvard is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I guess it was a little bit confusing to have two Cambridges. President Obama, in his Cairo speech of 2009, said no system of government should be imposed upon one nation by any other. End quote. In view of the appalling record of the United States in this respect, it is not surprising that this sentence received no applause. Nevertheless, in 2009, when this speech was given, anti-interventionist sentiment was strong in the United States and supported Obama because many citizens felt that they had been deceived by the Bush administration as to the reasons for the invasion of Iraq. Today, there is a contrary, if perfectly understandable, sentiment in favor of some kind of intervention in Libya. Many events have played into or challenged anti-Muslim feeling in the United States in the last 2 years. The protest against a Muslim center in Lower Manhattan produced liberal outrage at such behavior, exemplified by the support for this Muslim center by Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York. Another polarizing event was the plan of an extremely insignificant Florida pastor to hold a public Quran burning on September 11th of 2010. As hate speech is almost impossible to prevent in the American legal system, it took many telephone calls from important American officials, including General Petraeus, to stop this planned Quran burning. But in the meantime, terrible damage was done to the image of the United States and the West in general in the Muslim world. Alongside these events, we should remember the great blows to American public opinion occasioned by acts of intolerance toward Christian minorities to be found in some Muslim-majority countries. The danger that has driven so many Iraqi Christians to leave Iraq, the New Year's Day killing of 21 Coptic Christians in Alexandria, and the assassination a week ago of the only Christian member of the Pakistani cabinet, Shahbaz Bhatti, are all events that stand in the way of a sympathetic understanding of Islam. Yet, the Arab Spring of 2011, begun by the Tunisian Revolution, has had an enormously positive effect on American views of the Muslim world. Americans understand themselves to be advocates of freedom and democracy, and the images on television of Egyptians and people in other countries endangering themselves for this ideal has engendered a strong fellow feeling. On the one hand, Americans were amazed to learn that their government had energetically supported autocrats in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. On the other hand, those people ruled for many decades by autocrats must have wondered if Americans and the West in general believed that democracy was appropriate only for the West. The dilemmas of American policy remain. How are Americans to negotiate a peace acceptable to the Palestinians when Americans do not support the democratically achieved electoral victory of Hamas in January 2006? How will the United States adjust to democratic change in Egypt, where the general public is less favorable to Israel than was the Mubarak government? The question of non-intervention is as unsettling today as it was at the time of Obama's historic speech in Cairo. On a more philosophical level, I feel that the misunderstanding between the Islamic world and the West are more a product of their similarity than their difference. The great Victorian critic Matthew Arnold pronounced modern Western civilization to be the heritage of Hellenism and Hebraism, by which latter word he meant the Bible. Islamic civilization is also heir to these two traditions. The prophets of the Bible play an enormously important role in Muslim religious understanding, as is shown by the many Muslims named Ibrahim or Abraham and Suleiman or Solomon. Correspondingly, many pre-modern texts in the Islamic world declare that Aristotle was a prophet, indicating the profound respect for the Hellenic heritage after the translation movement from Greek into Arabic. The exchange between Muslim and Christian learning in the pre-modern period, both through agreement and disagreement, was possible only because of the similarity of the two traditions. To their credit, both Bush and Obama have said repeatedly that Islam is a welcome presence in the United States. In fact, the success of a Canadian television series, A Little Mosque on the Prairie, shows that a significant part of the public now accepts Muslims as fellow citizens and neighbors. Slowly, the barrier that separates the West and the rest, as Samuel Huntington called it, is breaking down in America. American Muslims, by and large, are so American that their non-Muslim fellow Americans see them, above all, as fellow citizens. Thank you.
I'm Jerry Leach. I'm the director of the Alwaleed American Studies Center at the American University in Cairo. I came in from Cairo yesterday. Over the last 6 weeks, of course, I've had a ringside seat at a revolution. I haven't directly participated in it, but I've watched it on television for 24 hours a day, and I applaud Al Jazeera's coverage, which was absolutely wonderful, thorough, complete, and interviewing everybody they could get their hands on, and many of my students actually participated, and I've had a lot of meetings with them, and we've started a project on the revolution. So I thought the greatest contribution I could make here tonight is to tell you some things about the Egyptian revolution, in particular those things that you might not have seen already or heard already from the BBC. The first thing is, what is a revolution? For me, it's a large-scale uprising of the people, their ability to basically remove the top level of the power structure, that is, the people that hold power in their country, and then to be able to restructure the way power is organized politically in their country. And Egypt is, of course, now, for me, does qualify as a revolution, and of course is still a revolution unfolding. If I had an hour, which I don't, I would start back in 1952. When the free officers took over by a coup d'etat and deposed the king, King Farouk of Egypt. But there is no hour. I'll just say that since 1952, Egypt has effectively been run by the military, and by that I don't mean by people in uniform. I mean by people who have been in uniform and have come up through military training, the military academy, then they've gone out of uniform and become the cabinet ministers and the heads of newspapers and the heads of universities. Even today, 80% of the people who run the different governorates or the provinces of Egypt are former members of the military. So the military in civilian clothes essentially has basically dominated the power structure of Egypt since 1952, and it would take me some time to go into why that is the problem that it is, but it is. Given the shortness of time, I'm going to leap immediately to what are the precipitating events that led to this revolution that started on January the 25th, and it's alternatively called the Egyptian Revolution or the January 25th Revolution. What is it that led up to that caused such an uprising that is in fact unique in the scale in which it took place in all of Egyptian history going back for 5,000 years, if you like. Now, the event which really started this going was a death of a young Egyptian, 28-year-old university graduate by the name of Khalid Said. He lived in Alexandria. He was essentially for Egyptians a kind of everyman. He was not a protester. He was not political. He was not involved in any of the parties. He hadn't run for office. He hadn't done anything to criticize the state security or Mubarak or whatever. And yet on June the 11th, he was yanked out of an internet cafe in downtown Alexandria. He was taken into a nearby residential apartment building by two members of the state security police, and he was beaten to death. Now, beaten to death, unfortunately for the officers of the state security who did it, unfortunately they were caught on people's cell phones, not only taking him out of the internet cafe, but actually beating him. They denied they did it, of course. That has been proven wrong, etc. And what happened immediately after that was a large-scale uprising of young Egyptians who finally saw that the people who were educated in Egypt were not immune from the actions of the security police. And the same thing that happened to Khalid Said could actually happen to any one of them. So there were youthful protests all over the entire country. The youthful protests led in a matter of days to the creation of a Facebook page called We Are All Khalid Said. And We Are All Khalid Said means this could happen to any of you on Facebook. There are 5 million Facebook users in Egypt. This could happen to any one of the 5 million and any one of the people that you know. In other words, this is more personal than you realize. This kind of treatment could come your way, etc. Now, Facebook being so popular in Egypt, Facebook immediately had 130,000 young people in its network on the Khalid Said site. That was by the end of June. And as of today, it has about 500,000 people signed up for the Khalid Said site. The next stage in the process that started this revolution was, in fact, the November elections. There were parliamentary elections in November. They were elections of the sort that Egyptians have had before. There were theoretically some competing candidates. There were some constituencies where there were no competing candidates, and the election went forward ostensibly with everybody participating and everybody hoping that this was a somewhat reformed election, maybe in line with the one they'd had in 2005. In fact, in November, what happened was all the opposition was wiped out. They effectively got no seats, or I think the total out of 450 is 3. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which had 20% of the seats in parliament, they were effectively wiped out. And nobody but the ruling National Democratic Party got seats in the election, those plus independents, etc. So everybody in the country knew without a shadow of a doubt, without anything having to be proved, that this was a completely, totally rigged election, and the NDP had basically pulled out every stop to see that it got as many possible seats as it could, etc. So the phoniness, the complete and total illegitimacy of the November election is the second of the events that basically came to produce the revolution of January the 25th. The third was, in fact, the bombing that Roy mentioned earlier in Alexandria, the bombing of, on New Year's Eve of a Coptic church service done by a suicide bomber, killing the people in the congregation, etc. It's never been clear who did it, but Egyptians have come to believe that it was done by outside extremists for the purpose of fomenting additional conflict or basically stimulating further hostility between the Muslims and the Christians, the Copts, in Egypt. In fact, it's had the exact opposite effect, and the relationship between Egyptians, that is Muslims and Christians in Egypt, has in fact not been closer than it's been over the last month. So it had the effect of greater community building and greater bonding as opposed to sectarian violence. Then finally, of course, was the deposing of one of the dictators of North Africa, namely Ben Ali in Tunisia. That happened on June the 15th. And then about 4 days later, the Khalid Said website and the Khalid Said Facebook basically called on all Egyptians, starting with Egyptian young people, the Facebook users, to appear in Tahrir Square on January the 25th. And many thousands were expected, probably several tens of thousands, and what happened was the turnout started at 50, went up to 100, 150, 200,000, and kept climbing, if you like. So that was the beginning of the revolution, January the 25th, and the call to protest and the call to basically now bring Mubarak down, and it was the Khalid Said website that basically stimulated and started all of this. Then there was 18 days in which eventually the revolution went up to the point where no less than 1 million people were in the street. In fact, there's no good count, but it's clearly above 1 million because there were at least 1 million people in Cairo, a city of 20 million, at least 1 million people in Cairo. And yet, though you saw on the BBC protests in Alexandria and protests in Suez, there were actually protests in about 25 to 28 different cities all around the Nile Delta, up and down the Suez Canal and down the Nile itself. And this essentially basically leads people to believe that the level of protest probably reached in the order of about 2,000 people, 2 million people on the street, if you like. Now, February the 11th came, and of course Mubarak left. He went to his place in Sharm el-Sheikh, etc. And people were overjoyed. And they have since, of course, a lot of things have happened and the protests have continued. The coverage has fallen away on the part of most television and indeed newspaper services. There's a little bit going on, but there's a great deal that's happened, and some of the most interesting things that have actually happened since February the 11th when Hosni Mubarak stepped down. The first thing is now people believe in Egypt that they can call out onto the street when they have a good reason for doing so, at least 1 million people, and that will cause the government to stop and listen to them, to consider what they are saying, etc. In other words, they've shown a version of people power which they did not believe in. They didn't actually understand that it was possible. I've talked to my students many, many times about people power, and nobody had any notion that 1 million to 2 million people could come out on the street at one time and speak with one voice. And now they know it, and they now know it, and they know they're going to use it again when the government does not listen to them. So they have, I'm only getting into the most important part. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. There's just so much to say. I'll give you a real quick account and then say I have a handout over here which summarizes and will give you greater detail. The fear that Egyptians have felt towards their government since 1952, and it has been heightened over the last 30 years under the Mubarak regime, that has basically melted away. People don't fear the government any longer. The pride they feel in Egypt is much, much higher than it's been. In fact, the sense of national shame and humiliation is gone. The three things that are selling like hotcakes in downtown Cairo are the Egyptian flag, the T-shirt, I love Egypt, and I'm proud to be an Egyptian. And everybody's wearing them, and they're all over the place, and the students at AUC are wearing them, and they're wearing them as a badge of honor. The relationship between the people and the army is much, much stronger than it was because the army never fired on the demonstrators in the course of the 18 days, etc. Next, there's been a much greater sense of unity between Copts and Muslims. There's basically been now a sense of the legitimization of young people being an active and legitimate force, a proper force in Egyptian politics. They were basically just rabble-rousers and troublemakers, and they had no legitimate political voice before this revolution. Now, the Supreme Military Council calls in their leaders and talks to them and says, what do you think? How do you regard what we've done? What do you recommend, etc.? Absolutely unheard of 6 weeks ago. The women of Egypt, they are now planning a 1 million women march in Cairo, largely because the Supreme Military Council has not figured out to this point that 30 to 40% of the protesters were actually women all over Egypt, and they haven't favored women with their appointments and what they've done since February the 11th when the military council took over. And of course, one of the most dramatic and unusual things is something very simple. All those demonstrators spontaneously cleaned up the places that they made dirty and where they left trash, etc. This, you couldn't imagine an Egyptian crowd, an Egyptian group, cleaning up after itself, and they've done it all over Egypt. And so it's really one of the things that you can say, yes, the spirit of the people, what they stand for, is really different now, and they see Egypt differently. Changes real quickly in the power structure. Obviously, the president's been deposed. The president, the first lady, the two sons, their spouses, the in-laws, and indeed the children have all had their assets frozen in the United States and Switzerland and in Egypt. They're banned from traveling. They are under investigation for their corrupt practices. And of course, now the press is wide open, largely because the Ministry of Information, which was the Ministry of controlling information and making sure you didn't get any information, it's gone. They've closed it down now. So now the press just seems like the press in the rest of the world. Even Al-Ahram, which is the government newspaper, basically is just reporting like any other newspaper would on the facts and the circumstances, if you like. There've been an appointment, there've been 2 prime ministers stood down since the beginning of the January 25th revolution, and we have a current prime minister who's a scientist from Purdue University and the University of Cairo. And what's so striking about it is he was recommended to the Supreme Military Council by the protesters, who asked, who would you like to see as prime minister? They nominated him. He is now the prime minister of Egypt and making the further cabinet appointments, etc. Now, since February the 11th, the people who've been stood down from power are one by one having their assets frozen, they're being banned from traveling, they are being investigated, interrogated, and the trials are actually starting. Listen to who they are. The Minister of the Interior, probably second only to Mubarak in terms of who the people really hated. The Vice President, Omar Suleiman, whom you saw much on the BBC, the Tourism Minister, the Housing Minister, the Information Minister, the Minister of Trade and Industry, the Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources, the head of the Radio and Television Union, the head of the Industrial Development Authority, the Speaker of the Parliament, the Speaker of the Shura Council, the upper house, if you like, the former Chief of Staff of President Mubarak's office, and 2 of the leading businessmen who were principal figures in the NDP, if you like. Parliament's been dissolved, new elections have been set for June, presidential elections for August. The military has said, and people believe it, that they will withdraw from power in 6 months' time. The current constitution, which very, very heavily was slanted towards Mubarak and his cronies and the NDP, has effectively been, is being reformed right now. There's a constitutional referendum to take place on the 19th of March, and 3 of the 11 recommended amendments are that limit the president of Egypt to 2 terms, a maximum and total of 8 years in office, and then no further period can he hold no further period in the presidency or in office. Creating an open process, letting anybody that wants to run, who can meet essentially very low standards of eligibility, to run for the presidency, and authorizing an independent oversight of all Egyptian elections by the judges, who have a degree of independence which they fought for over the years. All the political prisoners have been released. The heads of the state-owned newspapers have all been stood down. There are new editors in all the major papers, certainly all of them run by the government. The Muslim Brotherhood has been brought into mainstream Egyptian politics, and the Supreme Council meets with them, etc. There's vastly better and more honest, accurate journalism on television, in writing, etc. The state security, those of you who know Arabic, the Amna Dawla, basically has been stood down and frozen, pushed back into barracks, and said essentially, you know, you have no function now until we figure out what to do with you, etc. And the Amna Dawla have been withdrawn from monitoring all the Egyptian campuses all around Egypt, basically stopping whatever they chose to stop, etc. So, expectations for a better future. These are alive and well. What are they? Proposing that after the new president is elected in August, there will be a brand new constitution, and the people will participate in writing it. 1. 2, the military has told the people, and now they believe it, we will be out of office, we will relinquish control to the civilians in 6 months' time. The Ministry of Finance is now collecting pieces of paper from all around Egypt of everybody who's unemployed, with the understanding that the government is going to take unemployment seriously and do something about it. And people are now sending in these sheets of paper saying how long they've been unemployed and what their skills are and all the rest of it. There's the beginning of the creation of new political parties. Okay, final point. All right, there's an expectation that the state security police will basically be eliminated on the part of the people, and they're expecting the end of military trials of civilians. I wish I had more time, but if you want to see this in greater length, there you are.
I now know how long a 1 minute is. So when you wave this at me, I'm going to spend as many minutes, or as many a 1 minute as my previous speaker. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks. First of all, just to say, perhaps I have the dubious sort of reputation amongst my colleagues. Some may say the distinction of being the only Scottish Arab director of an Alwaleed Center. When people ask me what my religion is, I say I'm a Scottish Presbyterian. Muslim, so that is what I am. Having lived in Scotland for a long, long time, of course, I haven't forgotten how to look at the world from Scotland. And I'm glad that you referred to Balfour. It's actually Balfour who brought me to Scotland as a Palestinian from Jerusalem. I wanted to come and claim my right of possession of a bit of Scotland in... And in fact, there was a time when we first came here, West Linton, the Balfour estate, was put on the market, and I went with my wife to look at a flat there to buy it and raise the Scottish flag. So I hope the time will come when we will liberate a bit of Balfour and give it back to the Palestinians. Now, my point about Scottish Presbyterian, Arab, Muslim, all of that is actually serious because I'm an insider. I've lived most of my life here. I can't look at the Arab world, the Muslim world from the outside. I can't look at this part of the world from the outside. Let me just say to you that I just will run through a series of points with you, but I'll have to have a contract with the speakers because I know that we are pushed for time. You direct most of the questions to me so that I can give the things that I wanted to say out in the question and answer session. So if you agree, then I'm going to accept to be very brief. Let me just first of all say, I don't think that what we are seeing in the Arab world are revolutions. What we are seeing are people's uprising, intifadat al-shu'ub. Because a revolution, to my mind, will have a very fully worked out ideology, it will have a leadership, It will have also people sort of working towards a point. And I think what we have seen in the Arab world are genuine expressions of people power in the positive sense of the term. If you say, who is the leader of the uprising in Egypt, you can't name one. And if you say, who was the leader in Tunisia, you can't name one. If you say in Libya, you can't name one. So analytically, please, what we want to do is to say, is this a revolution or not? And what I want to say is that the Middle East perhaps is providing us with a different way of looking at the world. And that's very, very important that we grab this and say we want to challenge, if this is a revolution, what is a revolution and how does it look like? That's one thing. Secondly, I want to give you a glimpse of how culture is so crucial in that kind of uprising. And I want to say, and perhaps I'm arguing against Hugh here, that the thing that has become very clear to me, that Arabism, cultural Arabism, is not dead. Cultural Arabism is alive. Remember, there were Velvet Revolutions, there were Orange Revolutions, there was an Iranian Revolution, there were many revolutions, but the Arabs have not risen. But when things happened in Tunisia, then this sort of spread of Arabist feeling has started to come through. And you see it at a number of levels. First of all, there's the greatest delight watching our brothers and sisters in Tunisia marching down the streets and reciting poetry that I learned at school in Jerusalem. إذا الشعب يوما أراد الحياة فلا بد أن يستجيب القدر ولا بد لليل أن ينجلي ولا بد للقيد أن ينكسر. Poetry has been marshaled. Poetry that is very well known in the entire Arab world. Poetry that I learned off by heart, and I can actually recite the whole poem here, Professor Malika. So what is happening, she's from Tunisia. What's happening here, there's this idea of Arabism that's coming back, and thank God for that, for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. Secondly, if you look at the first initial people phoning in into Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, even BBC, and talking to, you'll see that it was actually, everybody was aiming towards the Fusha, the high standard Arabic. To make it actually, the whole thing is to make this event known throughout the Arab world. And that's extremely interesting. Egypt started to use the Ammiya, the colloquial spoken of Egypt, only when the event started to turn into a carnival, and people started to use that. So links of Arabism started to emerge. And if those of you who've watched Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi in his first speech, he said something, before he started, he said, I'm not going to speak to you in standard Arabic in Fusha. I'm going to speak to you in Libyan Arabic from heart to heart. But then he spoke for about 30 minutes just using the Fusha, standard Arabic. He was actually speaking as an Arab, addressing an Arab nation. And we tuned in the same way. It's only when he came to threaten the Libyans, he turned into the colloquial Libyan, spoken Libyan. It's only at that point. So what I want to do is to say to people, please don't just concentrate on content and message. Please, the channel for the message is very, very important. We need to read that importantly. Secondly, what has fallen in the last few days is this notion that Egypt is a fictive family. Mubarak said, I am the father of the nation. And he was surprised that his sons and daughters in Egypt did not respond in that way. If you listen to the Libyan TV station, there are songs that say, نحن عيلة ومعمر أبونا. There's a father, and the father is Gaddafi. And this fictive family is falling down. Because we need to remember this, is that the moment the notion of the father is invoked for an Arab Muslim, immediately you're taken intertextually into the Quran, where, if you rebel against your father, somehow, if you say oath to your father, then you're sinning against your God. And what's happening here is that people are saying, well, it is not that we are ungrateful to our fathers, it is that our fathers have become ungrateful to us. It is not that we who are in the wrong, it is they who are in the wrong. And it's very important. If it's about shabab, young people, you can't find a better expression than that in this. Now, again, the scarecrow of the Muslim Brothers and Islamism. Now, if Gaddafi goes, then the Muslim Brothers are again, Islam is going to rule. If Mubarak goes, Islam is going to rule. So addressing the West, saying to the West, well, look, you stand by us, support us, because if you don't, you're going to have a devil that you haven't known. We are devils, but you know us, and it's better to stick with the devil that you know than to actually slide towards a devil that you don't know. And it is very important to say that the Islamists were not the leading power in Egypt or in Tunisia or in Libya or elsewhere. And I'm saying that this is not a bad thing at all, because now we have a counterbalancing Arabism, which actually is far more inclusive than just Islamism. The role of the media is very important. People talk about the Facebook. But in fact, for the Egyptians and the Libyans, far more important than the Facebook is the satellite stations. The satellite stations have been absolutely crucial, particularly Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. And during Egypt, there was a fight between Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Al Jazeera won, Al Arabiya actually lost. But now they're coming together and they're becoming not the mouthpiece, they're becoming the thing that takes us into Libya and brings news out from Libya. Now, it's quite interesting that many of the terms that have been used by Gaddafi and the others to describe the rebels are things like Zanadiqa, the unbelievers. They're using Islamic language to demonize these people. And we need to pay attention to these sort of terms that have been used and the resonances of those terms. And finally, what I want to say is that people, when I was watching the CNN and Fox and the others, they've always discussed the events in Egypt in terms of Israel's security. What's going to happen to Israel's security? Well, frankly, I'm really fed up with this. I mean, are we saying that the Egyptians and the Libyans and everybody else has to pay a price of dictatorship so that Israel can feel secure in its own expanded borders and boundaries? In fact, I've been saying to my colleagues in Cambridge on the Hebrew side, that is what is required now is a revolution in Israel to get rid of the most right-wing government in the Middle East. Now, let me also say to you, when Netanyahu becomes center politics, then you know that Israel has tipped and gone in the other direction. When the radicals of the past, when the extremists of the past become the center, then you know that something is going seriously wrong. So what do I want to say? I want to say that I'm glad I'm alive, and I'm glad I'm here to watch what is happening in the Arab world. I've thought I would never see it, and I've seen it. So thank God for being above ground and not underground. And I just want to end by thanking Hugh, the principal, and Edinburgh, a place that I've worked in happily for many years, for organizing this. Thank you very much indeed. I've also learned the importance of Scottish time. So. Yeah.
I want to thank Yasir for yielding to me some of the minutes that he didn't take. First thing, I do want to thank the university. Everybody has thanked him, especially my colleague, for putting the program together, and also the Alwaleed Foundation. As I listened to my colleague from Lebanon, the first country I lived in was Lebanon in the early 70s. I was struck not only by your analysis, but your ability to talk about sectarianism and sects. And the reason I say that is that after I lived in Lebanon, I was asked to go to the State Department a couple of years later to do a briefing with three very senior people, and I was a very junior person and very, very nervous. But the one thing that I felt terrific about was I had a new secretary, and we now had what was a dictaphone, which came in, and I saw myself as this ahead of the wave, really strategic thinker and person. So I get the new secretary, she has the dictaphone, I give her the tape, she prints it out, gives me the copies, fly down to Washington, distribute the paper, and I'm talking about Saudi Arabia. And in there, they asked me to address the whole question of sectarianism and sects. Well, I'm from Brooklyn, and I have a problem in my pronunciation. So as I'm reading my paper, I say, and now I want to address sects, and I look at the text, and it's SEX in Saudi Arabia. Everybody looked up. And so I thought, she made a mistake. I moved to the next paragraph. After about 3 minutes, I got up, I collected my paper, sat down, and then gave my presentation. I cannot promise to do the same thing tonight, but what I do want to address is, I think, a very important question. Does the new dawn that we're seeing in the Arab world require a new framework for U.S. Muslim world relations, or for Western Muslim world relations? The end had to come, but as Yasir said, no one expected it anytime soon. In fact, there would have been many who would have said, not in my lifetime. I can remember talking to young Egyptians just a couple of months ago who in effect were saying, I'm 28 years old, the only president I've ever known is Mubarak, and kind of this is the reality. And whoever it gets handed off to, whether it's a son or somebody in the military, I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. The predominance of autocrats and authoritarian governments in much of the Arab world and the Middle East, with their entrenched security apparatus and military, had led many of their citizens to question whether significant change could occur, but had also led many in the West to be very complacent about the fact that there was nothing to worry about. We had our guys, they might be bastards, but they were our guys. We committed that, we had that same problem in other parts of the world. The repercussions of what's gone on are considerable, as we know. How did Western governments respond? In general, waking up every day, holding up their finger to see which way the wind was blowing. And often you would see equivocating. You would see perhaps the Secretary of State in the United States talking very strongly about the Bahraini monarchy and our allies. And then on that same day, have the president talking about the people of Bahrain and the importance of the people of Bahrain. How to respond then became a major issue. And although that time is changing a bit, the problem that we have to deal with is the fact that, as that placard in Tahrir Square said, in effect, we don't need you. That sense of empowerment is there. But how do you then get out ahead of the wave and get some credibility and move forward? Your old paradigm doesn't work. First question is, are you going to realize that that's been shattered and you have to put a new framework in? And are you really going to be able to accept the implications of that new framework with regard to issues of self-determination and the kinds of leadership or governments that come in and whether or not they're going to be more independent than others have been? Can you truly accept the idea that one has to accept those whom the people elect? And in fact, the track record, certainly of Western countries, whether it came initially after the invasion of Iraq and the expectation that we knew who we wanted to see in there, somebody like a Shalabi, or the election of Hamas. And even the continued notion of saying, is this going to be another Iran? Comparing apples and oranges, but not even have a sense that one was doing that. What it took a while to sink in was the fact that not only had the leaders and the rulers created a culture of authoritarianism within which everybody grew up, knew the limits, and they became acculturated by, but that indeed we had become acculturated by the very system that we had put into place. And we didn't see the significant conflicts. We could have president after president talk about democracy and not feel any compulsion to deliver on it. Remember, it was during President Bush's administration when we couldn't find the weapons of mass destruction. But you'll be happy to know that Vice President Cheney is sure that they're still there, and I'm sure at some point we will find them. But when that wasn't there and we wanted to play the democracy card, what did we do? We had Richard Haas, ambassador, senior State Department official, say on behalf of the Bush administration and acknowledge that the United States, under every president, Democrat or Republican, had practiced democratic exceptionalism. Okay. Now, having said that, at the same time, in some of our reports, we would chide the very governments that we were supporting on issues of human rights. So are we really going to be able to break out of that system? And particularly when many of our members of governments in Europe and America, many of those in parliaments and Congress, are influenced by not only the old paradigm, but growing Islamophobia, which is getting played out. And to what extent does that then affect the way in which we talk not only about the other within our own society and casting them as the other, but still dealing with and having a problem with dealing with religion when it comes to the other overseas. Now, should we have been stunned by what we saw? Not really. Problem was we were still using an old paradigm. Until only a few years ago, we relied on experts who had similar credentials and took opposite positions. We relied on elites within countries and governments who not only told us who they were, but explained to us who their opposition was. and what the dangers would be if that opposition ever came to power, and why they had to crush them. But in recent years, through major polling by Gallup and Pew and other international outfits, and for the sake of transparency, I'm a senior scientist with Gallup, but as a result of that data, we now know what the people that we talk about actually think and want. So they had to become a factor. But often what they thought and wanted went against the conventional wisdom. So what do? Too often, we ignore it. I think President Obama in his Cairo speech clearly demonstrated that he was aware of those facts. But the challenge for President Obama then was to deal on the vision, and that hasn't happened in any significant way for a variety of reasons. The realities of American politics, the position of the US Congress on a lot of these issues, the Israel lobby, but one can also talk about Europe's failure at times to deliver on that. So we know from hard data that 35 to 45 countries, that majorities of people in the Muslim world, in fact, want greater power sharing, wanted rule of law, wanted more transparency, wanted to address issues of corruption. We know that majorities feel very strongly about women's rights, even though it often does not exist in many of those societies. And yet those issues still get raised in a media which still deals in the stereotypes. You know, you deal with, we're beginning to break out of it, but the stereotype that somehow Arab and Islamic culture is not compatible with democracy, not compatible with gender equality, etc. So can we move beyond that, and what does that new way forward and that paradigm look like? Remember, I'm Italian-American, and I know where your family lives. So don't get aggressive. Okay. I don't want to sound like I'm threatening. I can already feel you physically starting to move towards me. Okay. The challenge for American and European policymakers will be replacing the conventional framework that relied on and heavily supported regimes and their military to ensure stability and security. They must move beyond their past opting for a policy that equated protection of national interests with the stability and security of regimes, driven more by fear of the unknown, of a process whose outcome cannot be controlled. As many of us know now, major polling shows that anti-Americanism has nothing to do with culture. It has a great deal to do with our foreign policies. So again, we have to begin to emphasize that. If we get back into a framework in which we think it's simply reaching out and touching someone and thinking that public diplomacy is simply that kind of, public relations, we're going to have a problem. We have to be prepared to make significant changes, both in the way that we approach governments and new governments that emerge and the problems that they may or may not have, as well as finally addressing the Palestine-Israel issue. If we continue not to do that, that's going to have repercussions for more populist governments that come into the region, and then we're going to simply say, look, you can't deal with these people. We made a mistake. We need to have tried and true allies, people who will deliver. A new framework has to be based on working with democratically elected governments, whether we like it or not. The question is what process is put into place and figuring out ways to deal with it. We like Turkey's government, the new government. They work well with the US and Europe, but as soon as the Turks disagree with us, we have a problem. Rather than say, oh my God, Turkey's doing exactly what we claim, and we want others to realize when we say, look, I'm really sorry, but ultimately we operate with national interest. Well, other governments have to do that, not only because it's good for their society, but they're not going to get reelected unless their people see them operating in that way. That's going to create tension. In contrast to the past, the US and Europe should place primary emphasis on investment in education, economic, and technological change and reform. This is exactly, again, what hard data from the region talks about, rather than substantial military aid. And when we give aid, it has to be far more controlled. Again, we have to be very careful about that. Critical, as people in the Arab world move forward, will be whether or not they can retain that same sense of unity that united them in overthrowing regimes or in getting greater reforms, and despite their differences, work together and make the compromises that are needed to move forward. whether it's between secularists and religious, Christian and Muslim, Arab nationalist, socialist, you name it, but working together. And that will remain critical. And particularly being able to move towards doing what regimes could not accept the notion of a loyal opposition, and being able to put that in place. If one merely now reinvents the wheel vis-a-vis those that one disagrees with, and learns from the very culture of authoritarianism that one grew up with, and just decides, well, now what you do with all the people is you cleanse, there's going to be a significant problem. Finally, it's not that long of finally, when Barack Obama went to Cairo, he affirmed an unyielding belief that all people yearn for certain things: the ability to speak your mind, to have a say in how you are governed, confidence in the rule of law and the equal administration of justice, government that is transparent and doesn't steal from the people. That should have knocked out right away our aid to many of these countries. Ironically, when he went to Egypt, the aid had already been given and with no strings attached, because we wanted to give it with strings attached, but at least the word in Washington is that the Mubarak government pushed back on that, which was the typical pushback. You give us the aid, you can say you want it for youth or AID, but it's for the government to decide what they're going to do with it, and one can imagine where it's going to go. In the political transition that follows, emerging governments and reformers need to form national unity government to demonstrate commitment to political liberalization, the development of strong civil society and human rights. The litmus test will be the extent to which their policies and actions reflect an acceptance of basic democratic freedoms, diversity of opinion, multiple political parties, civil society organizations, and the extent to which Western governments can accept that however different those governments are, these factors are in place. And finally, and I think this is very important, we're challenged on three fronts that remain: the issue of democratization, the issue of Islamophobia, and the issue of global terrorism. On democratization, both Western countries and countries emerging new governments in the Muslim world, as well as those that reform, are in differing ways challenged on the issue of democratization. How they understand it, how they apply it. For one, it's how they implement it. For the other, it's how one attempts to kind of support without attempting to lead. The issue of Islamophobia is extraordinarily strong. That is not because I have a new book that came out this week with Oxford called Islamophobia and Religious Pluralism in the 21st Century, which is the ideal Eid or Christmas gift, I want to point that out, or Hanukkah gift, okay? It's not for that reason, but Islamophobia is becoming, and we see it playing out in Europe. We see it playing out in the UK. The UK is moving in directions that a number of years ago I never expected it to move in. As well as other countries. And the same thing is playing out in the United States. It is becoming a political football, not only used by anti-immigrant parties, but in the US by mainstream parties, as we saw in our congressional elections, and we see it now at the hearings this week, but also in the UK when we look at some of the statements made by Mr. Cameron and even Mr. Brown before it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of my colleagues for their presentations, and I hope that as well as getting a sense of the activities of the different Alwaleed centres around the world, you've also got a sense of the unique potential of this network, given that we are based, as you would have seen, in the United States, in the UK, and also in the Middle East. It's been very good to have recent first-hand impressions from both Beirut and Cairo. Now, we've got something like 15 minutes for questions and comments, and we've got 4 students who are kindly going to help us running microphones around. Can I ask you to put your hand up and indicate clearly so that the microphonists, if that's an English word, can see you? If you're directing your question towards a particular member of the panel, can I ask you to mention his name in your question? Otherwise, I will direct as I see fit.
It's pronounced Esposito if you want to, just so you get the name right.
There's a question here in about row 6.
Hello. Maybe this is best directed at Professor Esposito. He mentions Islamophobia, but probably the wrong pronunciation, sorry. One of the key things maybe to put to you is how the panel in general views, particularly how you view, the issue of religious tolerance, because it was flagged up in one of the early presentations that, Coptic Christians in Egypt, aren't treated particularly well. Churches in the Middle East are very dilapidated. In Saudi Arabia, there are no churches. There is no freedom of worship. And, to the average citizen watching this, they see a lot of tolerance in a country like Britain. We have a mosque over here, freedom of speech, etc. Whereas you don't have that in the Middle East. I wonder how important you think that is in terms of improving the dialogue between the Western world and obviously Islam.
Well, let me begin by saying that if you go to Huffington Post and Washington Post on faith, I've written 3 different pieces, very much in reaction to Egypt, Pakistan, Nigeria on this issue. What is surprising to me and what is of concern, except for now the recent events, there seems to be a swinging back, is that the situation actually in the last 2 years was deteriorating. That is, in areas like Southeast Asia, which used to be celebrated far more, not that they were in problems, as very kind of having a long tradition of religious pluralism, etc. Malaysia and Indonesia have had some significant problems. And in other areas that was occurring. On the one hand, there were positive moves that were occurring in the Gulf, for example, churches being built in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, etc. But in recent years, in the last year or two, things have gotten worse. I would point out that I think that some of the positive side that's coming out, whether or not anything's going to happen, is that both in Egypt and now if you jump all the way over to Pakistan with the killing most recently of the Christian minister, there has been a kind of wake-up time among significant portions of the population. And the question is whether or not that can then get people to move forward. I think that's important. But let me just end with 2 things. One, let's not be very complacent about Christian history and its tolerance or lack of tolerance, okay? Now, you can say, but that was in the past. Well, the reality of it is society's developing at different stages. But Christian intolerance was far beyond, anything that existed within Muslim societies, at least in theory, if not always in practice. And there's an overflow to that, i.e. that intolerance influenced a good deal, and still does, of Christian attitudes towards the Middle East. The right-wing Christians, the militant right-wing Christians, okay, who are often militant Zionist right-wing Christians, have a high tolerance for the use of violence in going to war. Okay? We need to be concerned about that. And also with regard to growing Islamophobia. There are lots of people who fear Islam and aren't Islamophobic, and there are people who are Islamophobic and it's not due to religion. But a significant portion of the preachers of hate are not only to be found in the Muslim world, but to be found often, for example, in America, among Christian ministers, and the repercussions of what they say. But there is no doubt that Muslim societies, that one of the points I had at the end, but which, of course, the moderator prevented me from getting to, talk about, I feel like I'm living in Mubarak's Egypt with this guy, was the issue of pluralism, religious pluralism. That is a major challenge, I think, for many Muslim societies today.
Just on a point of accuracy, of course, you said there are no Christian churches in the Middle East. There are, of course, churches in many parts of the Middle East. Not all, it is true. Anybody else on the panel like to comment? No? Okay. Other questions, please. Question about row 8 on the far side.
Hi. I should probably preface this by saying I'm the assistant head of a school, so this is about education and following on from the gentleman's question there. It's really about how the panel thinks the education of young people from the ages of 8, 9, all the way through school should develop in the West and the Middle East to better promote a comfort with each other's culture and each other's faith. And I'd just be interested in all of your opinions, but given the time, I'll leave it to the moderator to decide who.
Anybody like to have a go for starters?
That's for you, I think.
That's for me? Okay, I'll point it back to me. Clearly, the philosophy of the Alwaleed network is very much promoting better mutual understanding between the world of Islam and the West. And it is, I think, generally a unique network in that here we are, some centers in the West trying to promote a better understanding of Islam, matched with centers in the Middle East designed to promote a better understanding of the United States in particular. Nobody else is trying to do that, as far as I'm aware. One of the issues for our discussions tomorrow, in fact, is collaboration. And that question might perhaps have pushed us in that direction to reflect further on what that means in practice. But I think we're all committed to better mutual understanding, very much in the spirit of the Foundation's vision.
And a number of our centers engage in outreach to teachers and to students. You know, in high schools across the country, a number of people here are consultants on projects that produce materials that are used to educate students. And a number of us lecture all over the Arab and Muslim world in reverse situations and have our students that we train go back, who come from that part of the world. But it's 25 years ago, none of this existed. 20 years ago, in any significant way.
Right.
I think there's a very strong case to be made for the creation of textbooks about moral reasoning that take examples from these cultures. I mean, we have the story of Joseph, we have Midrash on it, we have the Christian take on it, we have the Muslim take on it, Muslim commentators, different takes on it. I think this is a challenge that we have not yet, for 30 years I've been asking for this. We have not yet created books about moral reasoning, which you can teach in a school that does not have a religious affiliation, that nevertheless take examples and show that these traditions actually have multifaceted interpretations of the moral dilemmas presented in the different traditions.
And there's no reason why that shouldn't be done in schools that do have a religious foundation.
Yes, no reason it
universal
shouldn't.
challenge.
No reason it shouldn't. No reason it shouldn't. But I'm amazed that such books haven't been created.
There's a question here on my side about row 6.
Hi, I'm just interested to know what you think is happening or might happen in Saudi Arabia. And I'm also slightly interested in how the Alwaleed network will be positioned in that discussion at the moment.
None of us are from Saudi Arabia, of course. Anybody like to have a go? John, I mean, would you feel...
I'll crystal ball it.
Yep, okay.
And probably be wrong. I think that the pressures in the region clearly, and my colleagues referred to this, are of great concern for many of the rulers in the area. My wife and I were really stunned because we happened to be in Oman just about 2 weeks ago. And I remember I was doing a media interview on the second floor of our home, and my wife was on the first floor when they announced that there were demonstrations in Oman, and she was yelling up to me saying, "You're not going to believe it," because Oman, for a variety of reasons, was seen as very different. Clearly, the response of the king when he went back, with the significant amount of funds that are going to be pumped into the society to address these issues. I think looking at the statement by Alwaleed in the New York Times is very interesting. But clearly there are other forces within Saudi Arabia. I think that certainly, I don't see how the government would not have to move forward with reforms. The real question is the pace of reforms, but not whether or not there will be further reforms. And I mean beyond this. And in fact, Alwaleed mentioned that when in congratulating the king and talking about it, if I remember correctly, he talked about the fact that, obviously this is the beginning of a process. But you have various forces, and within that context, I think the reforms will move forward. But you're not going to see, overnight reforms. But I think there's no doubt that it's not just going to be economic reforms. There are going to be reforms about more, as it were, power sharing.
And I think it's worth saying some of the pressures we've heard from other parts of the Middle East in terms of the tensions between the different generations, of course, also apply in Saudi Arabia as well. And the older generation doesn't see things in quite the same way as the younger generation. So that's a universal trend within the Middle East.
One thing I would add to that is that I think that if Israel is to be called to account in this process, and I think it's very good that we've had that included here, then necessarily Saudi Arabia will have to be also. That the two, as it were, go hand in hand. So if you do have theocratic states that are imperfect democracies because they are theocratic in nature and they are exclusive in nature, that it makes no sense whatsoever that these demands will be made, and I think they will be made on Israel, that they're not also made on Saudi Arabia. I simply think it's inconceivable.
Question at the front here, and then about halfway back in the blue shirt.
It is really most enlightening to see this level of engagement with the other in the Middle East. I'm a little bit concerned, though, that when we reach out to the other, we continue to see the other as the other, when in fact these three religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, are really different sects of the same faith. So I wonder whether we could explore a little bit more the commonality between the faiths rather than seeing them always as the other.
Is that one for me as well?
I'm happy to talk about this. I think when you look at it, you'll discover that there are lots of shared values between these faith groups and faiths. And the challenge now is try to actually reach into those shared values and bring them out into the open and say, while there are diversities and differences, there are also many commonalities. At the same time, what I want to say is that these different civilizations are not structured around faith and only faith. There are other things that come into it. One of the things that I feel very sad about in the Arab world is that it orients itself towards the West, and mostly the West. And when I go to speak there, they say, I would like to see a reorientation towards China and the Far East, the so-called Far East. So what we need to do is to actually have a more inclusive outlook, whereby other civilizations come into it, instead of just always seeing it as faiths or East and West, and the East here is the Arab sort of world. And the other thing, of course, is this, is that I really don't recognize it as such. I just don't. I think what divides us is sometimes hyped up, and what unites us is sometimes depressed and not given visibility. So our challenge, you and us, and everybody's challenge, is to give visibility to those shared values and to bring them out into the open, in the knowledge that there will be strains in those relationships, which we have with each other as individuals, as groups, as collectivities. Certainly, I don't, for example, organize my activities all the time around the fact that I'm a Muslim, or a Palestinian, or an Arab. I'm a floating kind of person who says, this is what is important. And for the project that we had done, contextualizing Islam in Britain in Cambridge, we actually looked at the Sharia as a moral path. We said, if you look at the Sharia as a moral path, then you actually have you've given yourself the opportunity to exercise judgment as an individual. And we need to also bring this out in terms of education, in terms of the media, in terms of also how we engage with each other.
Just a quick point. I think we need to also begin to deal with religion in a far more sophisticated way. That is, our society deals with religion the way in which Orientalists used to deal with it, and which many of us were trained, which is, you want to know what a religion believes, you look at their scriptures, or the early founders and fathers. You don't look at what people really believe today. So people, for example, if they want to talk about, I don't know what, the use of violence, or the notion of a holy war, or a crusade or whatever, they go back and they cite text or points of history years ago and don't talk about, well, what do the vast majority of believers actually believe? And I've seen this even played politically. People will get up and say something like, well, you want to know what Muslims think about democracy? Well, so-and-so, the leader of the Jamaat-e-Islami, or Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood, 40 years ago said X. What they don't say, they're quoting something said by somebody who was living 40 years ago, responding to European colonialism. What they don't say is that many of these groups are now participating in the political process. And then finally, I want to thank you for the question that you asked, because you helped me to realize another dimension of my problem that I had said earlier. When you said that, in fact, what we've got are 3 sects of the same faith, I heard SEX again, and I realized that's because Catholics have such a problem with sex. That's our defining dogma, as it were, in terms of our major issues. So I've learned so much here tonight. Thank you.
There is a question about just over half the way back on this side, somebody in a blue shirt.
Thank you. I was very enthusiastic by the discussion today, in that it makes it realise that the world is actually a small place. But my question is really stimulated from what Jerry said, is that in terms of what happened in Egypt, has it been stimulated by the openness of technology and actually giving the voice to the small person, in that even though the world is dominated by democracy, but it gives an opportunity of being more transparent, and particularly I noted his reference to Facebook by giving more interaction, more integration, but more importantly for me, in terms of my work, in terms of building communities, more understanding that communities can be different, but they can live side by side. Do you think that what's happening now is not only affected the Middle East, but also going to be affected the Western world and incorporating what is happening in Asia?
Jerry, would you like to start on that?
A lot of interesting questions in there. First, the technology point of it from your early remarks. The technology, of course, is what facilitated the revolution in Egypt, largely because the government couldn't stop it, couldn't control it, didn't have a mechanism for being able to squash it the way it does almost every other form of communication. And of course, in the course of the revolution, shut down the internet and shut down cell phones and the like, but Facebook kept on going. So that's the thing that was allowed people to come together. The second thing that it exposed, of course, is that there are a large body of educated people, and then some, less well educated, and they feel that they are essentially voiceless in their societies. Nobody listens. Nobody will pay attention. You can't write to the government and get an answer. You can't speak to your representative. You can't write to the president and present a petition or argue for change. You are essentially voiceless, and you've been effectively educated to believe that that should not be. You shouldn't be voiceless, but you are, etc. Then finally, you have a whole body of younger people who started this, and it's expanded to all groups, all occupations, all parts of society, Christians, Muslims, older people, younger people, basically came to participate in it. That got it rolling, etc. And all of these people had a wide variety of grievances they wanted to bring to the table, but none of them felt like they could trust the government that they had. They were basically so distrustful that they never believed anything that it said and never expected to be able to believe anything that it said. And what they really wanted to do was bring about an end to all of these circumstances that I've quickly outlined. They also wanted to renew the greatness of Egypt, because there you have a body of people who believe that this was a great civilization, but now it has, until this revolution, lived in shame. It's been humiliated. It's been humiliated by dictators. It's been humiliated by the treatment of Palestinians. It's been humiliated by U.S. foreign aid. It's been humiliated in a wide variety of ways, and people simply got to the point where the tide was broken, and they simply were not willing to accept that any longer. That's one of the reasons that the volume of protesters was so great, much greater than anywhere else in the Arab world so far. And I mean by that, proportional to the size of the population, much greater. So there is, there was a huge volume of pent-up demand etc. And it was brought to the explosive point on January the 25th, and it's basically remaking the power structure and power sharing in Egypt. And I believe it's going on the proper path. In other words, what people really want is actually what's happening now.
Could I just add very quickly? I think, just to build on what Jerry has said, it's very important to distinguish between causes and means. The Facebook can't create a reality out of nothing. So there must have been something which you have been trying to outline. And it's really very important to concentrate on that something, on those material causes and non-material causes that have led to where we are. And I just want to say this, that when all of this is behind us, the question of Palestine and Israel, as John has said, will come to haunt us again. And the Americans have actually disgraced their foreign policy by not supporting the Security Council resolution to say that what is illegal. And they have done that at a time when there is democracy and revolution and everybody else. And I can tell you, this will be noted. I'm also thinking one thing. What would the questions have been if this event was in Beirut or Cairo? There would have been different questions. That's my expectation. We are still sort of obsessed with this idea of faiths, and I think we're beyond that now. We really are into a different kind of game. We need to think differently about it.
On that somber note, I must regrettably draw the formal proceedings to end. We have gone on a little bit over time. Apologies to those who have had their hands up and wishing to answer questions. But may I formally thank all the panelists once again for their contributions. May I also thank the Alwaleed bin Talal Foundation for its generosity, which has made the centres and the panel possible. And can I perhaps give the final word to Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, and to think of that famous phrase, to see ourselves as others see us. If citizens of the world of Islam, citizens of the West, can learn that skill, then I think the world may indeed be a very much better place. So thank you to you all.
This production is copyright The University of Edinburgh.